I posed some questions to you all at the end of our previous session. Before walking back in, I've done a quick whip around the room, asking people, putting them on the spot, if they discuss some of those themes and what some of those answers may be. As everybody takes their seats, I'll share with you basically some of the sentiments that I received in response. So the questions that I put to you all as delegates in the room and online was really about if the data matters, how do we stay on top of the data that matters in keeping it current? If accessing AI is going to be part of the future in unlocking the fuel for innovation, then what is the accepted cost as a nation that we might accept to power that AI? There were a few other questions around trust as well, but the sentiment that I got from everyone that I asked, very anecdotal evidence, a small sample, was that this is really about the government setting the guardrails for Australia to be able to really solidify and establish that trust. It's a great segue to the last session of the day, with an important discussion dissecting the intricate web of factors influencing the future of agriculture as we experience those tectonic shifts of trade. To direct the conversation, I'd like to invite Tina Hutchison, the Deputy Secretary of the Agricultural Trade and Regulation Group. Tina leads more than 1,800 staff across Australia and in 16 countries around the world to secure and grow Australia's agriculture, fisheries and forestries trade. With over 25 years of experience within the department, Tina is a key executive responsible for enabling Australian agriculture, fisheries and forestry exports. Please welcome Tina to chair this discussion.
Thank you very much and good afternoon everyone. I'm particularly excited to be with you this afternoon and the opportunity to talk not just about agriculture but agricultural trade and not just the challenges it presents but equally the opportunities, because there is no doubt that Australian agriculture is a strong and vibrant industry, agriculture, fisheries and forestry. There's good, strong demand for our high-quality produce, not just in Australia but around the world. And we've assembled for you this afternoon a terrific group of people to share their immense experience, their very varied experience, and I know many of you are keen to hear from them. So you'll have an opportunity today to either ask your questions directly if you're in the room, or if you're online, there's an app. Please get those questions coming through. The intention very much after we've heard from our speakers is to allow you to ask the questions that get the most out of the panellists we have here this afternoon. So, with no further ado, I will introduce the panellists just so you know who is on the stage and you can start thinking up your terrific questions. But then we'll be hearing a keynote address as well as a scene setter before we get into the questions. So here this afternoon we have our keynote speaker, Vangelis Vitalis, who we welcome from New Zealand and thank him very much for coming across here in person. He's the Deputy Secretary, Trade and Economic of the New Zealand Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. He's New Zealand's Chief Trade Negotiator, leading negotiations for many bilateral and multilateral agreements, such as New Zealand-European Union Free Trade Agreement and the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Prior to taking up his role in Wellington, he was New Zealand's permanent representative to the World Trade Organisation in Geneva and also chaired the WTO's agricultural negotiations from 2015 to 2017. So in a moment I will welcome Vangelis up to speak to us. Also here today we've got James Fell, who leads ABARES research on agricultural trade issues. Policy makers around the world look for evidence bases to support policy making, and we heard about that in the data session before afternoon tea. And James' teams provides and influences the evidence available in global policy circles. The team's research focuses on trade barriers, climate change, global food security and trade liberalisation. We also have with us Dr. Pru Gordon, the Executive Director and Founder of the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment, proud of prior to founding ACETI, Soft Sea, Pru was an advisor to the Australian Ministers for Trade, Tourism and Investment, as well as working in trade for the National Farmers Federation and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Fiona Simson is currently Oceania Representative and Vice President of the World Farmers Organisation. Fiona's previous role was with the National Farmers Federation, where she was the first female president, and she was instrumental in leading the launch of the NFF's 2030 Roadmap and Australian Agricultural Sustainability Framework, which we heard a little bit before the gap this afternoon as well, and welcome hearing more of this afternoon. Fiona sits on a range of boards and committees, such as Nature Repair Advisory Committee, Australian Commission for Agricultural Research and Food Bank, and was recognised as the 2024 Rabobank Agriculture Leader of the Year. Tim Ryan is the now CEO, congratulations Tim, of the Australian... It's amazing what can happen in a week between the writing of some notes and the event actually occurring. So welcome Tim as CEO of the Australian Meat Industry Council, certainly a very important peak body that the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry engages with, representing meat retailers, processors and small goods manufacturers across the country. Tim has a decade of experience in the Australian red meat industry, with roles spanning advocacy, market research, economic analysis, business development and trade, and market access. He's also a board director of PrimeSafe, Victoria's regulator for the safe production and transportation of meat, poultry and seafood products. So an absolutely terrific lineup this afternoon. There'll be no shortage of fabulous things to talk about. And to get us started, I will welcome Vangelis Vitalis up to give us his keynote address. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much particularly to ABARES for inviting me. And congratulations on your 80th anniversary. You are such a key institution for us, including the free riders in New Zealand. But I was really... It was something of a dream come true to have an opportunity to come and address you as an economist myself, and so I was really pleased and excited to come and speak. At the same time, after that first excitement had worn off, I sort of had a slight sinking feeling because I really felt for all of you. And it was because I'm reminded of this old joke about trade negotiators. It goes something like this. The person goes to the doctor and the doctor says, "Look, I'm really sorry, I have really bad news. You've only got 6 months. 6 months left to live." And the person said, "That's terrible news. There must be something you can do." He said, "Look, medically, I'm really sorry. There is really nothing we can do. You just need to enjoy those remaining 6 months." The person says, "But doctor, please, give me some advice. What could I do?" And he thinks for a moment. The doctor thinks, and he says, "Actually, there is one thing you could do. Please, doctor, tell me what it is. What is it that I should do?" He says, "Well, why don't you go and live with a New Zealand trade negotiator for the next 6 months?" And the guy says, "What? I've got 6 months. Why would I want to spend it with a New Zealand?" He said, "Because those 6 months, they'll feel like an eternity." I was going to say Australian trade negotiator, but I thought I wanted to leave this conference alive. I'm going to speak in 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to talk about the international context. I'm going to make the observation that I do make in a New Zealand setting, and sadly have been making for 9 years, that this is really the end of the golden weather for agricultural trade, international agricultural trade policy. And I'm going to talk about what I mean by that being the end. And I don't date the end to January or November last year. I actually date it back to 2015, 2016, which was the last time multilaterally we did something for international agricultural trade, and that was the elimination of agricultural export subsidies at the Nairobi Ministerial in 2015. Then I'm going to talk about the fact that, yes, the world is a challenging place, the jungle's definitely growing back, but the imperative for reform, specifically, and I'm going to focus particularly on agricultural subsidies, the imperative for reform is as strong as it has ever been, if not stronger. And I'm going to argue to you that the classical pieces, the trade and the development dimensions to reform, they remain important, but we need to add 2 more to that. One is food security, and the second is environment. Those 4 represent compelling propositions to drive and to continue to push for agricultural reform. In my 3rd section, I'm going to touch on how I think that can be done. And I want to argue to you that there's a variable geometry approach that's required now in this turbulence that we're now facing. One is we don't give up on the WTO. We continue to push there. But we also start thinking about what we might do in some of our plurilateral free trade agreements, and what we might do even outside of the classical free trade agreements, but look at what we call in New Zealand open plurilateral agreements. And then I'm going to draw some sort of concluding observations. But let me start with the end of the golden weather. So the golden weather in New Zealand, we date it back to 1995. End of the Uruguay round. Agriculture, for the first time, was brought into the rules-based trading system. The agriculture agreement entered into force. And for the first time, we had enforceable rules. Small country like mine, we took big guys to court, whether it was the United States, whether it was the EU, whether it was Indonesia, whether it was our closest friend and partner, you, apples. I'm sure you were wondering when I'd say that. But look, the system really worked. Each of those, during this golden weather period, people brought their regime into compliance. So if we won a case, the regime was brought back into compliance. We had certainty, we had transparency, and there was another core principle that the WTO provided us all, non-discrimination. The same tariff that New Zealand applied against Fiji was this, Fiji's a bad example because it was at the time, but the same tariff we applied to, let's say, Thailand was the same tariff we would apply to the United States, same as the European Union. The only way that changed was if you had FTAs. Non-discrimination, a core principle of the WTO. Enforceability, a functioning dispute settlement mechanism. Two core pieces that drove that golden weather for both of our countries, and a whole lot others besides. And during that golden weather period, we were also negotiating free trade agreements. Now, many of us, especially those of us who are economists, kind of struggled with the FTAs because really multilateralism is best. But there's no denying that those FTAs delivered a whole lot of benefits to all of us that were negotiating them. So during this golden weather period, we had an enforceable dispute settlement mechanism, we had protectionism declining, and we had market access being opened for agriculture, the most protected sector internationally. Those tariffs, those subsidies were gradually becoming what we thought would be a thing of the past. That was the golden weather. Unfortunately, that golden weather is well and truly over. We no longer have a functioning appellate body. We don't have judges to hear cases, to put it simply. The non-discrimination principle really is now under threat. That certainty, that transparency that our two countries have depended on is now very much a thing of the past. And it is not, as I keep saying, it is not a phenomenon that's just occurred. It's been happening, that gradual disintegration, that gradual fragmentation, that's been happening since 2015, 2016. So the rules can't be enforced. It's been 10 years since the Nairobi WTO ministerial that last did something on agriculture. We have failed at every WTO ministerial to advance the cause of agricultural reform. It is now nearly 30 years since the agricultural agreement, which had a built-in agenda, Article 20, that said, and reform should continue. And we've done nothing since 2015. Next year is the next WTO ministerial. It's in the Cameroon. And we should retain hope that we will find a way to do something in agriculture that takes us forward. I deal with the world as it is. I'm from a small country, so we have to deal with the world as it is, not the way we would wish it to be. But the imperative for reform, agricultural reform, specifically agricultural subsidies, is as strong as ever. I said at the start, there's a classical orthodox approach that we've been using. I believe both Australia and New Zealand have been arguing since 1995. It's about trade, it's removing distortions, it's also about development. African farmers, Latin American exporters, Australia, New Zealand, and our partners across Asia, we stand to benefit if those barriers, if those subsidies are removed. That's the classical piece. And on that classical piece, the numbers are as eye-popping as ever. The big guys have big, deep pockets, and they're spending it on agriculture. In 1995, the entitlement to spend on agricultural domestic support was $208 billion. Actual expenditure was quite a bit less, $119 billion. Only 4 countries accounted for 90%. I'll let you to work out who they were. Only 4 countries in 1995 accounted for 90% of that expenditure. In 2000, it was just 2 countries accounted for 80% of all estimated expenditure in agricultural support, in agricultural subsidies. We estimate that by in 2019, the figure rose to $786 billion. $786 billion. That's the entitlement, but the actual expenditure, this is the significant gap in the rules. The entitlement, 786, actual expenditure, 112 billion. Still a colossal sum, but quite a gap. We estimate that by 2030, you'll be looking at more than $2 trillion worth of subsidies sloshing around, distorting prices, misallocating resources, and changing opportunities and decreasing the opportunities for our countries, but a whole lot of other countries in the World Trade Organization as well. So I've talked about the classical pieces. The 2 new pieces that we are increasingly seeing feature in the agricultural negotiations, and I would argue are big drivers of the need for reform, food security and the environment. On food security, 25% of global food production is traded internationally. Between 2000 and 2021, food trade has changed the kilocalories that people can consume from 930 kilocalories per capita to 1,640, a dramatic increase, but shows the importance of trade as a driver of that. Compounding the challenge is that we know that we're not able to produce the way we've been producing. In the Asia-Pacific region, it's estimated, for example, that by 2050, rice production will decrease by 14%, wheat production by nearly 11%, soybeans by 13 to 20%. So there is a big challenge coming. And on the environment side, there's some excellent work, and James is one of the key authors of that, about agriculture's contribution to some of the environmental damage that's out there, whether it's water, misallocation of water, whether it's overuse of fertilizers, whether it's damage to biodiversity, whether it's the fact that agriculture contributes 22% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So for all of those reasons, the imperative for reform internationally remains as strong as ever. So how do we do this reform? Well, the best way, as any economist will tell you, is, of course, unilaterally, because you know it's good for you. Unfortunately, there have been, I shouldn't say unfortunately, there has been some incremental progress. But you just need to look at those colossal sums, those taxpayer dollars that are going into the distortions that are in the system to know that that's not enough. So I want to argue that actually what we've got to do is we've got to have a variable geometry approach now. And the variable geometry is multiple tracks that we pursue agricultural subsidy reform in an international context. The first track is always going to be, and we'd be the last to give that up, is in the World Trade Organization. What that looks like is a discussion that we need to have. Clearly, we need to do something on food security, and part of that is not just the agricultural subsidy reform, but dealing with the big challenge posed to us by some of our colleagues on public stockholding. We are going to need to find a solution on that. We are going to need to find a solution, however, that does not unravel existing rules, but actually builds and supports and sustains those. And we've got to do something, and I would argue the first place to start looking is the water between the entitlement and the actual expenditure of many of our colleagues and partners in the World Trade Organization. Pulling that down, giving some certainty to farmers internationally that the distortions are going in the right direction, they're going down, and they will eventually be eliminated. The second track I think we should be looking at is free trade agreements. Now, we've traditionally said you can't do subsidy reforms through trade agreements. I'm not sure that's true anymore. In CPTPP, the 11 of us, now with the addition of the United Kingdom, have in fact dealt with subsidies. We've got a chapter that includes disciplines on fisheries subsidies. I think in the world that we're in now, there is an open question as to what we might do in agricultural subsidies in those free trade agreements as they come up for review. What might we do? What disciplines could we conceivably put together amongst us? And how does that, in the way that the CPTPP fish subsidies outcome, help drive the WTO negotiations to a successful conclusion? We need to envisage the free trade agreement piece as something of a pathfinder, as a signalling to the rest of the system. Here's some disciplines that can actually work. So unilateral, multilateral, free trade agreements, and the fourth is what we call in New Zealand open plurilateralism. That is about saying a small group of us want to try disciplines, transparency requirements, rules, standstills, rollbacks. We want to do that, and we're prepared to do it at a high quality. We accept that not everyone will want to be a part of that, but we're going to push that out alongside the other elements of that variable geometry. Because variable geometry is not just different paces and different speeds, it's also different coalitions. And it may be hard to envisage how an open plurilateral might be successful. I would say to you one thing. The P4 agreement in 2004 came into force in 2006, Singapore, Chile, Brunei, and New Zealand. It was an open plurilateral agreement. Between 12 and 14 years, depends on when you count it, that became TPP and the CPTPP. To do these things, you need some strategic patience. And patience is, I don't know about your sector, but I know my sector back home doesn't have a lot of strategic patience as they see the world in this turbulence. Hence my wish to see us running this across multiple tracks and being prepared to take a few chances because of the greater objective here of trying to drive reform back up and mutually reinforce what we hope might happen in a multilateral setting. So that brings me to conclude. So on the one hand, the golden weather's definitely ended, the jungle's certainly growing back, but I'm optimistic. Despite the big challenges out there, our two sectors internationally have been incredibly effective at dealing with these kinds of challenges in the past. So I am confident we'll find a way, and I do think that the imperative for reform remains as strong as it always did. Now, I said there were four: trade, development, food security, environment. I actually think there's a fifth. I use the metaphor of the jungle. I think in the jungle there's a really big predator out there. It's called macroeconomics. The sums that people are spending, I don't believe they're going to be sustainable. And so I think there is going to come a point that people are going to say, treasuries in particular, are going to say, I'm not sure we should be spending so much of our taxpayers' money on this, particularly given its trade effects, its development effects, its food security, negative food security effects, and its negative environmental effects. And I think that we've just got to start somewhere, and focusing on the entitlement versus the allowable, the entitlement versus the actual expenditure. That's definitely a place to start the conversation. As I said, a variable geometry approach that works its way through, but we need to run them, in my view, at the same time and alongside each other. And may I make just one last observation to close this out. To do any of this, some of the data I quoted is from 2019, because it's the only comparable data we have. That is not an acceptable situation. We cannot negotiate in the dark. We do need transparency, and it's why I was fascinated by the conversation just now by the statistics colleagues, but I actually wanted to give a big shout out to ABARES. And it's not just about the data. Data is really important. It's the analysis that you provide as a public good, thank you. Definitely public good. We call it a taonga in New Zealand, sort of a national treasure. You're definitely a national treasure in New Zealand. But it's also the analysis and the policy recommendations that you provide that give us so much richness to think about, that helps us understand what's going on in the world around us, the challenges we face, the opportunities that there might also be out there. So this is a really big thank you to this institution, 80 years old. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing it as excellently as your culture and tradition has sustained you. So thank you from me. But above all, it's not a counsel of despair. It is a challenging world out there. But our countries still have agency here. So there's urgency to this. But we've got this. And I am confident that we can advance agricultural reform in a measured, structured, thoughtful way with your help, the help of ABARES, the help of a whole lot of partners around the world who are going to be thinking not just about some of the challenges, but some of the opportunities out there. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, and a fabulous opening to this session, and you left us with some very powerful imagery. We heard you talk about the golden weather, which in and of itself is a lovely way to think. You then talked about the jungle, and I like the idea of an apex predator out there in the jungle, but you named the apex predator and how that actually might be of assistance as we work our way through the jungle. But importantly, are not able to negotiate in the dark, and we heard a lot about that session, about bringing that information forward. So to pick up on that idea, I welcome James Feld to the stage to lead us through, or to give some thoughts and prompt us to the audience to put some framing around that for the next part of the session. Thank you very much, James.
Thanks very much, Tina, and thanks very much, Vangelis. Very kind words about ABARES analysis, and of course we always value New Zealand's collaboration and contribution as well. My name's James, everybody. I lead the trade research at ABARES. What I want to do today is kind of help shape our thoughts for the panel discussion, as Tina's just alluded to. Perhaps I'll plant some seeds in your minds. You know, where do we want to be? That's what I'd like you to have a think about. Or where do you want to be in terms of agricultural exports? Do we want lower tariffs? Do we want to take measures that enhance global demand? Or should we, we've seen Jared's presentation this morning. Do we want to focus on harmonising trade rules? And that can mean things like technical market access rules, MRLs and the like. And this comes under the broader umbrella of non-tariff barriers. Should that really be our focus? We've seen from Jared, rising non-tariff barriers. We'll have another look as well. And we also heard, particularly from Ben this morning, on sustainable agriculture. Should that really be a focus, for example, of market access heading forwards? But before we do that, I really want to have a bit of a look at where are we now so we can best understand these issues. We heard from, I think we heard from Jared this morning that, agricultural tariffs have come down, and we can see kind of what Vangelis was talking about here. Have a look at 1995. That's where we see the fall coming down. Now, you'll see some different numbers every now and then floating around. It just depends how you define agriculture. We've taken a comprehensive approach here using the WTO definition as agreed to by many countries in 1994. And you can see that the basic message here, though, is that agricultural tariffs on the whole have gone down. This takes into account free trade agreements and regional trade agreements. It takes into account the WTO tariffs, also called MFN tariffs, most favoured nation, as Vangelis was talking about, that everyone gets treated the same. Hence, most favoured nation. And I just want to do a shout out to the team. The calculations here are really impressive. It takes 3 days to run actually on the computer. 2,000 odd agricultural products, 40,000 bilateral routes to consider every free trade agreement in the world. So well done. And non-tariff barriers, which is also a significant effort to delve into this. We heard from Jared that not only is the number of non-tariff barriers going up, but it's also the effect per measure is also going up. So what we're seeing here is a tariff equivalent. So you say, how much would trade change with this non-tariff barrier, and what's the equivalent tariff? So what we're seeing in 2022, that on average across grains, red meat, fruit and vegetables, equivalent to around a bit under a 20% tariff. Now, when we add these numbers up and we do some broader modelling that takes into account trade diversion, just on those 4 categories there, we're looking at about a $4 billion cost on Australian agricultural exports. But that's not just Australian agricultural exports, it's of course Australia's broader exports as well. So it's a cost to the economy. So that's something for us to think about. And here's an issue too. Look at behind the border support. So, reductions in subsidies, output and input subsidies in other countries, support the prices that agricultural exporters can get on world markets. Now, if we have a look at that orange line, that's basically the developed countries. It's the percentage of output and input subsidies. It's actually budgetary support going to producers as a percent of farm revenue. And it's not, as you can see, it's not really doing anything. Likewise for the 11 emerging economies there. I've got to add that doesn't even take into account the price floors and price ceilings that India and China have, which are very significant. And I could stand here and I could say, are we on the edge of a cliff? But this theme of growing protectionism, it hasn't suddenly appeared. As Vangelis was telling us, for around 10 years, it was about 10 years ago that appointments to WTO appellate bodies, so where you go and appeal your cases, that the appellate body judges have been blocked there, and that happened 10 years ago. We've also seen a discussion this morning, touching on the ideas of onshoring and friendshoring and shoring up supply chains. And there's this overarching question of at what cost. And of course, we've got here some quotes about tariffs, and then we've got the question of tariff retaliation and what different countries will do. But these are all kind of policy, direct policy matters. But there's, a kind of a biophysical phenomenon happening here as well. We've got climate change in the background now. If we think that climate change is going to affect, for example, crop yields, or it can affect livestock growth, then it's going to affect production. It's going to affect trade as well. I want to do a bit of a shout out to the very clever researchers on this one that take a global trade model, every economy in the world, basically 500 odd simulations, and they take into account the increased volatility from climate change. They did crop yields, but it's a good demonstration of kind of increased volatility in global markets. And they said, what would be optimal trade policy? And they saw here some very clear results. It's not the case, in every simulation, but if you're a policymaker, you've got to make a call based on evidence. And on the whole, we see that a shift to more open trade leads to improvements to trade. It also leads to improvements to agricultural consumption, and there are other food security metrics as well. We also see production moving up because with open trade we see a reallocation of resources around the world, production moving to more efficient producers like Australia and perhaps New Zealand. Vangelis. So the question is, how do we get to... Actually, I just want to say that you can use a similar framework here for geopolitical uncertainty as well. So a good shout out to my colleagues on that one. How do we get to where we want to be? So I'm sure that you've all got various ideas, and I hope the panel can have a chat about this. What are the different options? Vangelis has put forward a couple, including plurilateral agreements. But should we pursue more free trade agreements? Should we bother looking at behind the border agricultural support? Should we pursue more in the way of technical market access and non-tariff barriers? We've seen that the impact of NTBs is rising and rising, and we know that tariffs can only fall to zero. We've got an example of that with our wheat into Vietnam. We know that the EU and Canada now have zero tariffs as well into Vietnam, so tariffs can only fall to zero. So what do you do after that? Just on the behind-the-border agricultural support, you know, there are some doomsayers out there. So this was in an online article, that one there, talking about the downfall of the WTO. We also, you know, perhaps need to consider plurilateral agreements, as Vangelis, you've mentioned, and, you know, does CPTPP. So for those in the audience, I'm going to try my luck here on the abbreviation. The Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. You know, does that provide a bit of a blueprint for addressing behind-the-border subsidies?
Fantastic. Thank you very much, James, for helping set the scene for the conversation to come. So what I will do is I'll just ask each of our panel members, Pru, then Tim, then Fiona, to give us your thoughts to open the discussion on some of the challenges facing agriculture in trade today. Thank you very much, Pru.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I think I've been blown away with the forecasts coming out of ABARES and the relative positivity that we've heard, because as far as I'm concerned, the key challenge is what we're seeing coming out of the Trump administration at the moment. In the past few weeks, in the past few hours, I think we are in completely unprecedented territory. So starting with day one, President Trump announced the America First trade policy, where everyone took a breath and thought, great, he's not imposing all the tariffs that he promised during his campaign. He's initiating a series of reviews to look at where the key problems are for US trade and what legal instruments the US had to try and tackle those problems for US trade. He then announced tariffs on Colombia when Colombia refused to accept some plane loads of Colombian immigrants returning, which seemed very effective because Colombia turned around and said, actually, we will accept those plane loads of returning immigrants. He then announced steel and aluminium tariffs of 25% on all countries. He then announced on the 13th of February the Fair and Reciprocal Plan. So the Fair and Reciprocal Plan basically nukes the WTO and the rules-based system. What it does is it tasks US officials to review all of the US's trade relationships to identify any taxes, non-tariff barriers, exchange rate manipulation, anything that the US considers to be fair or burdensome for US trade, written or unwritten, to compile these lists. And if you look at the United States Trade Representative's Office National Trade Estimates report for Australia, of the 6 different barriers identified as impeding US trade, you've got pork, poultry, beef, apples and pears into Australia. So they will be taken into consideration in this calculation that the US administration is doing as to all of the measures maintained by trade partners that are impeding US trade. Those reports will then be considered, and secretaries of different departments are then tasked with identifying a remedy. At the moment, the way you read the administrative order, it seems to imply that they'll calculate the impact of these measures and put a tariff number on it. So then a recommendation as to what kind of tariff will be imposed against a particular country will be then passed to President Trump for him to make a decision on whether he will impose that tariff or not. Then we had, of course, I should say, the US and Canada tariff announcements, which of course have been put into place or are being put into place as tomorrow morning US time. a 10% tariff was put on all imports from China. That was up to 20% overnight. In the last few hours, President Trump has tweeted on his Truth Social tweet that the US will be introducing tariffs on all imported food. So I have so much respect for ABARES, but the forecasts and even Vangelis, who normally is a very positive person, I think the picture that you painted does not fully convey the absolutely unprecedented situation in which we find ourselves and in which I think we are unprepared. So the tariff measures, the trade measures were bad enough, but I think what happened on Friday in the Oval Office with President Zelensky is even more of a warning call for us, because the US's President Trump's decision not to provide security guarantees to Ukraine and the very clear transactional position that the president took and his lack of willingness to support what have been really assumptions underpinning the NATO alliance, but also Australia's alliance with the US, that they will come in and help us if we are in trouble under the ANZUS alliance. I don't think we can any longer take those assumptions for granted. And I think Taiwan is looking very closely at President Trump, as is President Xi. And I think the decision, what happened on Friday will tilt towards President Xi a greater, I guess, preparedness to move to reassume Taiwan into China, that there is less certainty that the US will step up and protect Taiwan if China does invade Taiwan or blockade Taiwan. So if China does take Taiwan, what does the Australian government do? Do we say, well, we'll no longer trade with China, we'll no longer trade with Taiwan? And then taking it even further to okay, hypothetical, but so China takes Taiwan, is empowered. America is very, very busy making America, looking after America. Perhaps, I don't know, China would like, and this is hypothetical and I'm really pushing the boat out, but perhaps China really wants to secure dairy supplies and decides it wants to buy Fonterra. And New Zealand's really not keen on selling Fonterra. But guess what? China decides to send a few frigates to sit off Auckland to help with the negotiation. I think we are in a completely unprecedented environment, and the way government works with the private sector, who are absolutely at the cold front and who are going to be pivotal in terms of Australia and other countries' ability to weather what is coming, has to radically change. So sorry to be so negative, but...
Thanks for those thoughts, Pru. Tim, I'll just bring you in as very interested in your thoughts from the coalface, as it were, from an industry perspective. We've heard a lot of commentary already this afternoon, and really keen to hear where you'd like to pick up the conversation in relation to some of the challenges facing the industries you represent.
Yeah, thanks, Tina. And I'll comment on the scene setting and then also pick up on some of Pru's thoughts. Australia's great at producing food. We're a great exporter of product. But if I consider our industry, I feel like it's hard to find an industry that's benefited more from this rules-based system that we've created over the last decades in the post-war environment. We're a great exporter, but also the complexity that we've built into the business model now is so much more that we can pull an animal apart and send it to 100 different markets. That complexity that we can build in requires this rules-based system and certainty that we can send our products into these export markets. So we differ in that way, where we're disassembling something and creating all these different products, where other ag sectors are more commodity-based, I suppose. So we've got this complexity. The industry has transformed alongside it, where we've gone from a more domestic focus, locally smaller scale processing, into much larger integrated supply chains. Also coupled with two-way investment, where we've seen foreign investment and also Australians investing in market supply chain as well. So it's created a far more global business model for our sector. And with that as well, I think you can look to the long-term trend in livestock prices, particularly since the WTO and FTA is coming in on the back of that. We go through cycles, but generally there's been an increase in the real value of sheep and cattle in Australia, at least over the last 3 decades. So we've seen that flow back to farm gate as well. I suppose for us, concerning and looking ahead, it's far more risky doing business now. The world's changed a lot in the last couple of months, but also we've seen the niggles, as Vangelis talked about, over the last decade of the inability for multilateralism to push the agenda forward as well. So it's been brewing for a while. And we've also seen Angle's really good picture of the growth of NTBs and now being, equivalent to 20%. So for us, it's been a far greater focus than your classic tariffs and mitigating those. I suppose for us, where I'm concerned is how we manage risk going forward. There's concerns around new NTBs and tariffs, but even the fact that you look around the world, it's far more risky and far more scary place. So risk doesn't come free, and ultimately you've got to build that in, wear the risk or cover it somehow. So how we manage that risk and either simplify the business model or insure that risk in some way, ultimately it's going to be a cost borne by the supply chain that we have to consider. So we have to reevaluate the business model potentially. I suppose how we're viewing it, I think we need to double down. Pru made a good point about having good industry-government connections and relationships. Things are moving so quickly that we need those communication channels moving and being on a daily basis, if not multiple times a day at some points, even just looking at today's announcements coming out of the US. So we need that information flowing really quickly and really strong relationships between government and industry. I also think we need to double down on our government-to-government relationships and really invest in those over the next few years, particularly if relationships become more transactional. We need those relationships to be really positive and available, that we can rely on them when time comes.
Thanks very much, Tim, and I'll ask Fiona to reflect on what the picture looks like from your perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's no doubt at all that farmers deal with challenges every day. So I'm here today, I am a farmer, but I'm also here representing the World Farmers Organization. The World Farmers Organization represents 50 countries, 80 farming organisations. And so some people used to reflect that my role at the NFF was a little bit like herding cats. Quite unkind, I thought, to my NFF colleagues. But if that's like herding cats, then the WFO is very much like herding elephants. When you think about bringing all the different farmers together around policies that we can agree on in relation to all sorts of things, from countries like America, Canada, Europe, Africa, and Oceania, of course, as well. And, you know, for a trade-exposed industry, we've heard today a lot about how, and Pru, you painted a pretty dire picture, but it's probably a pretty accurate picture about how, you know, the trade environment as we know it is breaking down every day around our ears. We know that for somebody who is absolutely dependent on climate, we are seeing right now in Queensland, actually, the impacts of an erratic climate, and farmers have to deal with that on an everyday basis. We know now that the golden weather has ended, that the jungle's growing back, and we heard about the $2 trillion that will be sloshing around in subsidies by 2030. So there's a lot of challenges in our industry. But Tina, I'd really like to focus a little bit today on some of the tailwinds, because the best bit is that SDG 2, you know, around zero hunger, people have to eat. And at the end of the day, somehow or other, and hopefully the economists, the trade people, everybody else will get their heads together as well. But we have to do whatever we can to make sure that we can continue to work on SDG 2 while we look at all these other important critical issues as well, while we're looking at biodiversity loss, while we're looking at climate change, while we're solving some of these really, really pressing issues, we need to be looking at hunger as well. And the good thing is that it's not just the world's farmers that are looking and uniting on these things. It's also people like the World Bank, you know, the biggest economist of all, who is suddenly talking about the need for food agri-food system transition, agri-food system change on a massive scale. And I think actually that's the words that they use. And the World Bank has said it, but so have some of our biggest international research organisations that belong under the umbrella of CGIAR. And some of that, they even agree on the fact now that the trade distorting subsidies, which have played such a major part of our trade environment, actually now should be replaced. People like the World Bank are talking about the subsidies being replaced and replaced with a different, spending that money on other things that are going to help these farmers reform, that are actually going to help us achieve some of our biodiversity and climate change goals. That's going to help farmers be more sustainable, whether they are in Africa or whether they are, as a matter of fact, in America or in Europe. In COP28, we saw 160 countries sign a landmark agreement to integrate food and ag into their national climate plan. So that's a very positive thing. It's not just the farmers, it's not just World Bank and CGIAR, it's another 160 countries that recognise that we need to do everything at once. We need to concentrate on biodiversity, climate change and feeding the world as well. We do want it all. I think there's also a real growing public discussion now about the role of sustainability in trade. Yes, we've watched on and seen the demise of the WTO, and I'm not sure where that's going to happen. But what the world farmers are doing about that is that we're making sure that we can engage with credible, sensible, factual voices around what farming actually is, what we actually do in terms of sustainability, and inject those voices into debates that can have such an impact on NTBs and NTMs that actually impact us at the grassroots. So I think for me, yes, we are in a murky waters, but there are a lot of opportunities. And going forward, they talk a lot about the 3 Cs, about why we need agri-food system reform, which is, of course, COVID, climate change and conflict. But I also think there's 3 Cs for the opportunities going ahead, and they are conversations. We need to continue to have conversations with people that we agree with and people we don't. We need to collaborate wherever we can. Our supply chain are not the best at working together. Some of Tim's processors and the retailers and the farmers and the policymakers and the economists all need to work together to actually solve some of these wicked issues. And we've seen that over the weekend. So yes, it was a terrible, I think we all watched on with absolute shock and dismay at the Trump-Zelensky meeting. But then how good for him to go over to England and see those people standing strong and forming renewed alliances and having conversations. So let's collaborate, let's have conversations. And lastly, we need to keep corroborating what we do. So when I first started at NFF, I used to go to Europe and say, we have clean and green products. And everybody sort of went, oh yeah, we do. Yeah, clean and green. Excellent. Good on you, Australia. But now it's not enough to say that. They say, really? Show us. And so we have to prove that what we do is actually clean and green, that we are actually able to comply with some of the global standards and global frameworks. And that's where the AASF that you heard about earlier, things like that come in. And Australia is leading the world, and our farmers are leading the world. So as a agricultural entity in Australia, we have much to be proud of. We have much to actually stand up against some of these volatile conditions that we're working with. And as the world's farmers, we stand ready to do the same thing as well.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Fiona, Tim and Pru, who've added to the reflections that we've heard earlier and have given a very diverse and rich environment into which I'll invite your questions, because I'm sure there are many. So I'm just looking into the room first. Who would like to, we've got one just here. Thank you very much. And if you could just let us know who you are when you ask your question. Thank
Hi,
you.
well, Katie McRobert from Australian Farm Institute. I was just up there a minute ago. I would love to believe in Fiona's vision of the world. I am leaning, unfortunately, more towards Pru's vision of the world. And I was just going to ask the panel to reflect on the fact that you called it out there, Fiona, as a potential opportunity, SDG 2, Zero Hunger. But I've seen that zombie film, and people didn't get together and start sharing their food. They all went into little quiet bunkers and started shooting each other. Is that actually going to be a bigger threat to us as we see the breakdown in relationships across the world, as people do start to think about hunger being a driving force? Is that going to exacerbate the protectionism that we see, or can we genuinely get past that and collaborate better?
Who would like to lead us off? Thanks very much, Jane.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk. to that one, I think what's really important in terms of food security conversations is to understand what food security is. So there's a commonly used idea with 4 pillars. Goes back to the 90s actually, to a whole lot of global summits, including 1996 World Food Summit. And so we've got access, we've got availability, stability, and this thing called utilization. Can you actually use the food? There's not much point having something raw that you can't really eat. And understanding those pillars really then can push us in kind of a policy change direction. And I think that that's what's really important when we're kind of having trade discussions. There seems to be a tendency to think a lot about availability, which is the production or the stocks of food that we've got. But I can't remember who it was, but it was somebody well known, had a really great quote. It may have been Amartya Sen, actually. That had a really good quote that you can have all the food in the world, but if it's too expensive, there's no point having all the food in the world. It doesn't bring you food security. So what's really important is that access element as well. And in that we have a price element, we have an income element. Can you actually afford it? We also have that kind of the physical side of it. And so I think when we encourage people to actually drill down into food security, that's actually where we need to go in terms of actual policy change. Vangelis will be able to talk from perhaps some lived experience as to how these arguments go down in multilateral fora. I did mention, stability as well, stability of supply, stability of prices. But we do know that in these discussions that open trade actually pushes us in a more secure, food secure direction. It's a question of prosecuting those arguments and prosecuting them well. If countries lock themselves up, it leads to potentially dramatic instability in their food supply. Think about if there's a drought, suddenly where do you get your food from? You don't have the processes established, you don't have supply chains established. It makes life very difficult. And I mentioned this expression before, I said, but at what cost? And that's a question as well when you try to concentrate food production domestically if you don't have a comparative advantage in domestic food production. And it comes back to that argument about you can have all the food in the world, but if it's too expensive, what's the point? So just to come right around to your question, Katie, I think that in achieving those sustainable development goals, we really need to kind of hone those arguments directly to actual policy issues. And the same thing kind of applies on emissions as well.
Thanks, James. And Tim, I'll bring you in.
I was just going to add a short comment to that as well. Agree with what you said, James. I think different countries are responding to in different ways to food insecurity concerns, and some will put up subsidies or put up barriers, but also some will liberalise to bring in food. And we're seeing the last few years and more recently, the Middle East and North Africa is a really good example of removal of technical barriers, but also unilaterally reducing tariffs and opening up their meat markets for us. So I think through this, Australia can maintain a reputation as being a regular and reliable supplier of food to the world. And even though the jungle's growing back, I think we need to maintain that position.
Mm. Thanks, Fiona, and then I'll ask Vangelis.
So I agree about the role of trade in sustainability, particularly in food security. I totally agree about that. I also think, just from an Australian perspective here for a moment, I think the technology that we use in Australia to grow food, the water use efficiencies we have, the no-till farming techniques that we use, the soil conservation techniques that we use, a lot of that knowledge is now being shared through a lot of the Indo-Pacific. So if we think about, yes, you have to be able to afford it, yes, you have to have it available, but yes, there's also a lot of know-how and knowledge that is not there in a lot of the developing countries in the world that we're actively involved and engaged in at the moment, in a small way through ACR, but in a much bigger way through some of the African countries where they are actually now able to grow appropriate crops and improve their nutrition chances. So I think, yes, it's a massive goal, it's a massive multifaceted thing, but we just have to do it one thing at a time.
Thanks, Fiona. Vangelis.
Maybe just a small, I think James and the others have nailed it. Just maybe a small comment. There is a difference between food security and self-sufficiency. And that food security piece, I mean, there's many of our colleagues in the Asia Pacific, you think about Singapore, who really do need to grapple with that distinction. And I think one of the things that COVID did demonstrate after the first shock was actually you are going to need to allow some trade to flow, quite a lot of trade, and it was remarkable how it did come back because people did need to have that food and they realised they simply cannot produce it themselves. There are very few of us that are genuinely self-sufficient in agriculture, in food. So that system, but I think James's point is a really important one, which is you've got to engage with colleagues in a reasoned, structured manner that is based on data, to go to your point, Fiona, verifiable, robust data that is a time series that demonstrates the validity of the argument. Then, of course, you've got the challenge of trying to negotiate that, but that is a key part of how we get there. So I'm more optimistic without wanting in any way to discount the challenges that we face.
So I'm sorry to be a downer, but when I look at I seriously think sustainable development goals will be pushed aside. I think so many environmental issues, even climate change. When you look at the competition issue between the US and China, the United States is a very wealthy country, but at the same time, 76 million people voted for Trump on a platform of Make America Great Again. So just irrespective of the facts and the data, there's this groundswell, there's this belief that China is threatening the United States and that they needed someone who was going to stand up to China. I think Australia is a very wealthy country. We wouldn't know food insecurity if it whacked us in the side of the face. We live in a bubble. So when your fundamental way of life is threatened, all bets are off.
Although 3 million Australians are food insecure last year.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I saw that data, and I think it was produced by the Food Bank.
Food Bank.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take combine a question from some of our online colleagues, which goes to some of the points that you were making earlier, and it's about realistic options in the WTO, as well as combining with another question about Australia and New Zealand and the sort of influence we can bring given our size and where we sit. So I might start with you, Vangelis, if you've got some thoughts on that, and ask others as well. Thank you.
So maybe to make two observations. I mean, the realistic prospects at the WTO, I am an optimist. Because if you're a small state negotiator, you've always got an asymmetry of power that you're facing. So you can only be optimistic about what's there. But it is a fact that we're now 10 years after Nairobi, when the last time we did something. So it is really difficult to be optimistic. But nevertheless, you think about the trajectory of you just take agricultural support again, and you've got to hope that at some point, it's in the interests of all of the big powers at some point to have a look at that and think, okay, this is starting to actually affect me, big power X, as well as big power Y. Maybe it is time to do something. Now, coming to the influence piece, I don't kid myself about New Zealand's influence, but Australia is the leader of the Cairns Group, which is the agricultural exporting group of countries, and you're a G20 colleague. Sorry, not a colleague, because we're not in the G20. You're a G20 country. I do believe you have enormous impact, and you have people that do the work that we do that are really, obviously world class. So I do think that there is plenty of scope there to do things, but we may have to do some things differently. It may be that in the WTO we're going to have to think a bit creatively about how we form coalitions around particular subjects, how we try to bring those forward, what other options we've got outside, but always thinking how those other options can support the multilateral system. We must be very careful that we don't walk away from it, even inadvertently. I think that is really important, that that the things that we do in our free trade agreements, that we do in our open agreements, they are supposed to support the system, not, we do not want these to be the termites in the system, to use Bhagwati's phrase, a trade economist from a while back.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else like to come in on that?
Yes, because I can only agree. I mean, the multilateral system is unbelievably important, and despite so many countries, I mean, the US at the moment, but I mean, India hasn't been particularly playful in the WTO. It's all we have. I mean, rules and transparency is all we have. So incredibly important, but I suspect we're going to have to relearn all the lessons we learnt during the Second World War, that countries need to cooperate and that everyone benefits when we cooperate. So yeah, whatever we can do to maintain it, we go through the bad time and at the end everyone will go, oh, guess what? Rules are a great idea.
Thanks, Pru.
Yeah.
I'll go back out to the room if we've got another question out there. Someone's hand. It's a bit hard to see in the bright light. So someone got their hand up. Out there? No.
See, lots of people have
An
questions.
entire room of shy people.
Afraid.
That's
Shy Australians, wow.
you found them.
Can I comment, Tina? Seeing
please,
we've got a little
welcome.
gap here. So I think the WTO at the moment, so the World Farmers is looking at how it can engage with some of the other parts of the WTO. So obviously engaging with the WTO is tricky, its progress is tricky, it's stalled in some ways. But it's some of the things that it is doing. It is starting to look at sustainability, for example, and make it the topic of some of its public forums. It has a whole different range of engagements. And so I am a big collaborator, I'm a big conversationalist. And so I think the more conversations we can have, the better. So whilst I think the WTO, we need to absolutely still focus on that. We've got to remember that there are all these other global conversations all the time as well, and ways that we can encourage collaboration and conversations and perhaps coming to doing it around about a different way, which I know is not a direct route. But if you think about all the different, the COPs that we have, so we have the climate change COP, where we have all the countries coming together. What can they agree on, what they disagree on? At least it gives us a path forward. The same with things like the biodiversity COP, the desertification COP. Let's have some of these conversations and let's look at what we want to get out of them. And the same with the WTO. And then let's try and look at how we can use some of our influence in ways that will perhaps influence if we're in a new world order. Yes, we're not going to be the same. Hopefully multilateralism, pluralism, all those things will stay because they have to. And we might be going at a bit of a circuitous route, at least till the midterms. But, you know, where can we get to then and how do we keep driving that? And from an agricultural perspective, we want to make sure that everybody has the whole picture, not just one that's led by the green NGOs. We want to make sure that they have the facts, they have the data, they have the evidence, and we try and inject it into every one of those conversations that we possibly can.
Can I just make a quick, absolutely agree. Those international conversations.
Again?
No, I just think those international conversations are incredibly important, but actually international politics is the result of domestic politics. And unless we are talking to grassroots people within our communities and giving them really simple information that explain why these conversations are important and why these agreements are important, it doesn't matter. And just to plug, the reason we started the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment was to talk to the Australian general public about how embedded Australia is in global markets and how dependent we are on them in non-technical, short little blogs on our website. Because if we're not talking to everyday Australians, it doesn't matter how the best kind of agreements we make at the international level, they don't count.
Totally agree.
Thanks very much, Pru.
That was positive.
Yeah. I try. Generally positive. Yeah.
So we have a few minutes left before we need to wrap up the session. So what I might do is ask each of our fabulous panel to give some final reflections on what we've heard. We've heard a terrific range of views. We've had some realism injected with our optimism and some sort of practical ways forward. So I'll just ask for your final reflections before we wrap up this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, maybe just to reinforce them, I think in many ways it's, all of us in the panel have been saying it, is look, the world is definitely not what it was. But we should not just focus on the fact that it's just happened now. It has been happening. And I thought the data that you showed, I mean, you look back, it's 2015, 2016, you can see the trend line. It's been happening and we've forgotten. what the world was like before the World Trade Organisation. Let me give you let me give you an example from a New Zealand perspective. So before 1995, before agriculture was brought into the trade rules system, we had in my group, we had teams that would go to Brussels twice a year to negotiate a quota for 6 months. And that quota could change each time. The in-quota rate could be 20%, it could be 0. And we tracked it. We did a little bit of historical research when I first took over this role, and we realised that over a 3-year period, there was a fluctuation between 40 and 0. How can they possibly plan on that basis? We found that in 2 years, the in-quota rate changed while ships were on the water. That was the kind of volatility that we were dealing with back then. We have forgotten how challenging that world was. And, you know, we've taken entirely for granted, and great that we have, because so we should. It should be baked in. But it ain't like that anymore. And this world that we're getting into is going to require some real, I think, some real creativity on all of our parts, industry, government, and I actually think your point, Pru, the social licence, we've got to watch that is sustained here in our two countries. And I mean, I tell you what, in New Zealand, we almost lost it around TPP. You know, it was we had protests in the streets, never thought that would happen in New Zealand against the trade agreement. The social licence is something we've got to watch out for as well. That's fragile. This will be the last possible moment that we can afford to lose the social licence at home when we're facing the challenges offshore.
Thank you very much.
It was supposed to be positive.
And I think it opens up a whole another conversation for another time about what shift we might need to see in our engagement and how we tell those stories and how we tell them effectively and cut through in a different media age and a different technology age. So there's something to maybe think about and come back and reflect on. But James?
I'll just be really quick. I think in terms of progress, it's really important to tie into contemporaneous political themes. So be they some examples would be food security, it'd be emissions, broader sustainability issues. I guess that touches on a little bit, Pru, of what you were talking about, thinking about what people actually think about on the ground. But Vangelis has just made me think, demonstrating the benefits that we've already experienced and forgotten about to some extent is also a really important one.
Just as you, Fiona?
I think there's so much going on in the world at the moment that farmers really can't control. And they're used to that. And I think Australian farmers are as best placed as anyone to stick to their knitting and to concentrate on the things that they can control. And that's what the world's farmers are doing too. So when we start looking at how we grow our food and fibre, how we actually keep growing biodiversity outcomes, how we actually work in terms of climate change and taking on board some of the transition that we need to do, how we can actually then operate in this trading environment. In Australia, we deliver to so many markets. We're incredibly lucky to have a huge diversity of markets that we deliver to and people that need our food and fibre. So I think that Australian farmers and will generally stick to their knitting. We do a great job of it. We're some of the best in the world. We're having the conversations. We're collaborating widely, and we can corroborate with some of the work that we've been doing with government and the AASF. So I think we're as well placed as anybody to try and ride through some of these bumpy waves that we're going to be through for the next little while.
Thank you. Tim?
I think we've been fortunate in some respects over the last few decades that we've had governments from both sides of politics that have prioritised trade. We've got good people in DAF and DFAT that have opened up export markets for Australian farmers and exporters. And as we look forward, I think we need to look at the world as a riskier, less certain place that could change on a dime. We can't take our foot off the accelerator in opening up new markets, removing non-tariff barriers, because we're not sure when another market might turn off. So I think looking ahead, we need to make sure that we've got the right resourcing and investments by government in both DAF and DFAT at a personal level to make sure we can get in front of issues and address them when they arise, and then make sure those relationships with industry and producer groups are there, that we can respond effectively when things change quite quickly.
Thank you, Pru.
And I guess, just building on what Tim said, I think over the last 50 years, the relationship between the Australian government and industry has been, we'll get barriers out of your way and let you go and do what you need to do. We'll encourage other countries to get barriers out of your way. So it's very much a hands-off approach. Then over the last few years, we've seen the reintroduction of industry policy, which was a targeted involvement of government in particular strategic sectors, critical minerals, green metals, for climate change reasons, but principally for national security reasons. I think, and that was from President Biden's small yard, high walls. There ain't no walls no more. So I think Australia needs to look very closely at how government engages with industry, and there almost has to be a new thinking. I mean, government traditionally is petrified of sharing any kind of information and concerned they're going to get called up at Senate estimates and ask something because someone was told something. I think we need to rethink that.
We never get nervous about Senate estimates. We enjoy the challenge that comes around 3 times a year. We relish it. Thank you very much. As this afternoon's conversation exceeded my expectations. I was very much looking forward to this conversation, and I think I would like to ask you all to very much thank Vangelis Vitalis, James Fell, Pru Gordon, Fiona Simson and Tim Ryan. Hopefully you will be around for a little bit. There is an event later tonight, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a moment. I'm sure there is a lot of questions in the room that you didn't have a chance to ask, so please take the opportunity as you see our fabulous panel. But we're left with some really striking information and some mental models to take us forward. The golden weather, the jungle, I'm a bit obsessed by apex predators. I've never thought of them as economic, so I'm going to have to spend a bit more time with my ABARES colleagues. But I will finish on the 3 C's that Fiona, that you left us with around conversations, collaboration and corroboration, and that at the end of the day, trade is all about human relationships and how we engage with each other effectively to make sure that not only can we eat, but that we're clothed and we have places to live. And agriculture, fisheries and forestry provides all of that. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon, and please enjoy the rest of the terrific ABARES conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
As the panellists make their way off the stage, I would like to also say thanks to the delegates that have joined us online today. We will see you tomorrow. If we were to wrap a ribbon of sorts around some of the things that were discussed today, I think it could be best said with some of the themes that were mentioned in this last panel towards the beginning. There are undeniable challenges, but there is still agency. With that said, we will close the conference for day 1.